Okay.
All right, you're on.
Yes, well, anyway, good morning. I'm Tom Lombardo from the Center for Future Consciousness. And this event is the next module in my webinar series, The Evolution of Science Fiction. And as I've mentioned before, these modules are drawn from my book series on science fiction, the evolutionary mythology of the future. And right now we are moving into volume 4 of that book series, and it deals with chapters 1 and 2 in that book series, if you're following along. So far, we've gone through the first 3 volumes, Prometheus to the Martians, The Time Machine to Metropolis, and Superman to Star Maker. So today we're starting in on the Golden Age through the New Wave. So I have an image up here on the screen, a very significant figure of the Golden Age. If anybody happens to know who this is, since you're all audio mute, you can't say right now, but I will tell you who this is. This is a fictional character, one of the most famous characters of the Golden Age. This is the Mule. And the Mule, in some way, symbolizes various important themes that come up during the Golden Age. The Mule, in a sense, is the embodiment of chaos. The Mule is a mutant human who can control people's minds and their emotions. And the Mule is the famous nemesis in Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And in a little while, we'll get to discussing the Mule and his role that he plays in the future history of humanity. But this is a very good painting done by Michael Whelan, who is one of the great contemporary science fiction artists. So, the Golden Age. The center of the Golden Age is right in the center of the screen. John Campbell, who was the editor of Astounding magazine through the 1940s. And people usually identify the Golden Age of science fiction as being that 12-year period when Campbell dominated American science fiction as the editor of Astounding Science Fiction magazine. There's some other images up there too of significant writers and figures of the Golden Age that Campbell interacted with, mentored, and developed while he was the editor of Astounding. There's A.E. Van Vock on the left. On the right is Robert Heinlein. On the bottom right-hand side is Isaac Asimov when he was young. On the left-hand side, there's a picture of Asimov in the middle with Heinlein and L. Sprague de Camp, who is another significant writer of the period, taken during World War II. And right below Campbell is an image of Henry Kuttner and Catherine Moore, who were the first really significant husband and wife team writing science fiction back in the 1930s and 40s. And Catherine Moore, although there had been some women science fiction writers before, Catherine Moore, in my opinion, is the first great woman science fiction writer to emerge in the history of science fiction. And we will come to her and her husband a bit later on. So those are some of the key faces, some of the key figures of the Golden Age. Keeping in mind that it's usually associated with the early period when Campbell was editor of Astounding. Now, just to refresh our memory, last time we had a whole session on Olaf Stapleton, and we followed Olaf Stapleton as he created his magnificent cosmic billion-year sagas of the future history of humanity and the future history of the universe and the future history of intelligence with Last and First Men and Star Maker and Last Men in London, and his studies on a super intelligent human and Odd John, and a super intelligent dog and Cirrus. And at the end, I ended up comparing Stapleton with other previous figures in the history of science fiction, and in particular, H.G. Wells and Doc Smith. And if you recall, Star Maker was written on the eve, basically, of the beginning of World War II, where Stapleton was becoming increasingly concerned with the fate of humanity and the fate of Europe as Nazism and fascism became ever more powerful and disconcerting, and communism was obviously on the rise too in the Soviet Union. So we're going to take up this theme right from there. And this is just an outline very quickly of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how the golden age begins during a time of human madness and people questioning the very reality of progress. And we're going to talk about key figures, key writers, besides Campbell, Robert Heinlein, Asimov, and Vock, Kuttner, and more, and other writers. And then we're going to talk a bit about L. Ron Hubbard and his connection with science fiction and the Dianetics epidemic and his connection with Campbell. Mention a little bit about the comics, talk about some significant dystopias written surrounding World War II, particularly Swastika Night in 1984. And then we'll get into a bit on Christian science fiction in the 1940s with C.S. Lewis, and then go off into the absolute, utterly, totally mind-boggling metaphysical of Borges, and end with what I consider to be the two best novels written during that 12-year period, Earth Abides and City. So that's just a bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering over the next hour and a half. Now, the place we begin is with the city of tomorrow and the darkness of the day. In 1939, New York put on a World's Fair. And this World's Fair was created to enhance, stimulate the spirits of American citizens who were going through the Great Depression and also looking toward a time when the world may be entering into another world war. It was intended to be a look toward the future, an optimistic look toward the future. And the World's Fair took like 2 or 3 years to develop. They introduced TV with Franklin Roosevelt giving a speech on TV. They introduced the fax machine at this new World's Fair in nylon and fluorescent lights. They emphasized consumer goods, and they actually created this diorama, which involved people, you see them sitting in these chairs, looking at this city of the future. Now, interestingly, my grandfather and grandmother took my mother and her sister to this World's Fair in 1939. And it was this great extravaganza at the time. But Germany did not participate in it. The organizer of the fair had a very difficult time with getting Mussolini and Stalin to cooperate in putting up booths for Italy and the Soviet Union. Various countries pulled out of it after 4 months, because 4 months after this opened, Germany invaded Poland. And even though we have this optimistic vision of the future being presented at this World's Fair in 39, it was ominous, because in a very short period of time, this feeling of progress and of advancement and of coming out of the Great Depression got trashed, got smashed by the reality of World War II emerging. And it's important to keep in the context here that the golden age of science fiction occurred simultaneous with World War II, with the events of World War II, almost the entirety of it. And that's going to have an impact on science fiction writers, people who think about science fiction, had a big impact on Campbell as well. Because something I brought up on numerous occasions throughout human history, at least in the modern times, people have had both optimistic and fearful images of the future. And science fiction writers have dealt with both of those themes. And in the late 1930s, we see the New York World's Fair attempting to play up an optimistic and hopeful vision, but at the same time, people are becoming increasingly anxious and fearful over the looming darkness of the day. And in fact, one could even see the 1940s, the late 1930s, early 1940s, as a time of human madness. Quoting W.B. Yeats, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. And people again began to question whether we were making progress or going backwards, because once again, humanity entered into a great period of destruction, of carnage, of lunacy, of madmen ruling the world, or at least trying to rule the world. In the 1920s, Sigmund Freud wrote one of his most famous books, Civilization and Its Discontents, in which he argued that there were actually two fundamental motives or forces moving the human psyche, the life instinct, eros, and the death instinct, thanatos. And he wrote this after World War I, but in fact, it was suggestive or prescient with respect to the same kind of thing happening again 20 years later, where civilization is ready to fall apart all over again, because even though we keep making scientific technological advances, down deep in the human psyche, there's aggressiveness and there are unsettling forces, and we can't seem to understand and gain control of the human psyche. Now, science fiction is going to deal with that issue. Right after the war, Erich Fromm, who was a psychoanalyst, wrote a very famous book called Escape from Freedom, in which he argued that the reason that World War II emerged and the rise of authoritarianism and totalitarianism emerged and became so powerful, creating so much disruption in the world, is that people fundamentally are afraid of self-determination and their own freedom, and will run from it and follow authority that lets somebody else make decisions for them. And the reason why Nazism, fascism, communism captured so much of the world as authoritarian, totalitarian systems was because humanity at heart was afraid to determine their own destiny and would leave it up to authority figures instead. So in this, we have science fiction. Now, is science fiction during this period going to be prophetic? Yes, thinking about the future. Is it going to be reflective and reactive, that is thinking about what's going on in the world and what to do about it? Is it going to challenge us? Are we going to find heroes in it? Are we going to see depressive attitudes in science fiction? In fact, we'll see all of those. Because on one hand, you could say that, well, science fiction attempts to look toward the future, but at the same time, science fiction also is a reflection of what's going on in the world. And that is very true regarding the golden age. In fact, science fiction writers under the leadership of Campbell took it upon themselves to attempt to articulate a positive and constructive vision of the future as a reaction against the disaster, the falling apart that they saw going on around them. And eventually, a lot of them are going to come to the conclusion that the key to it all lies within the evolution of the human mind. And that's interesting because, of course, we associate science fiction with science and technology and not with the human mind, but I've talked about that already. And science fiction writers definitely believed, a lot of them believed, that the key to the whole thing was somehow we have to become better human beings in the future because we can't seem to hold ourselves together psychologically, and we keep creating lots of disasters around us. Now, let's begin with John Campbell. And there he is characteristically smoking one of his Chesterfield cigarettes, which he did most of his adult life. John Campbell was a scientific technological nerd growing up, that to use a modern expression. And he had a very difficult childhood. He had very few memories of his childhood. He had very difficult interactions with his parents, especially his mother. And at a very early age, he started to read science fiction and was very impressed by Doc Smith, who I talked about last time, Doc Smith's space operas. And Campbell, in his early 20s, actually wrote a whole series of very popular space operas, very scientific, technological in their nature, and became one of the most popular science fiction writers in the 1930s. And along the way, he studied physics, he studied cybernetics, he studied mathematics, but he also studied parapsychology. He went to MIT, he went to Duke, he didn't complete degrees either place. He struggled early on with making a living as a writer, but in fact, he was successful as a science fiction writer, reaching the ultimate of achievement in his story, Who Goes There, which I talked about last time, which came out in 1938. But in 1937, he was offered the job of editor of Astounding Stories. And Campbell stopped writing as an active writer and took over editorship of the magazine Astounding Stories, which was the biggest, most popular science fiction magazine of the time. When he became editor of it, he changed the name from Astounding Stories to Astounding Science Fiction and decided that he wanted to cultivate a more sophisticated type of science fiction story that would appear in his magazine than the more escapist and perhaps less literary type of science fiction that had been written before. Now, that's sort of taking too much of a negative view as to the quality of what was being written before, but Campbell was dead set on improving the quality of science fiction, and he had in his mind that as an editor, he could shape the future of science fiction and turn science fiction into literally a new type of mythology to guide humanity into the future, where we had interesting and capable characters who dealt with and solved problems using science and technology and their own personal qualities to deal with those problems, and for the stories to be written well. So Campbell went looking for new writers who seemed to embody his vision of what science fiction should be about, that a science fiction needs to be relevant. Science fiction needs to point a way forward. Science fiction needs to create convincing kinds of literature of high literary quality with believable protagonists. Two very good books that go into significant depth on Campbell and the years that he was editor of science of Astounding Science Fiction are The World Beyond the Hill, which I've mentioned before, which was written in the late 1990s. And it's the latter 2/3 of the book is primarily about Campbell and his relationship with his writers. And then more recently, Astounding by Alex Navala Lee, which deals with Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard, and primarily the golden age of science fiction. So if you want to read more about Campbell, and there's an awful lot to read on him, he's an interesting character. He thought that cigarette smoking, by the way, does not in any way have a bad impact on one's health. And he was a chain smoker with his cigarette holders and his Chesterfield cigarettes. But he was a very smart guy, very aggressive, had a very clear idea as to how he wanted to mold and shape science fiction. And he went looking for new writers. And he cultivated and discovered the three most influential writers of the golden age: Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and A.E. van Vogt. Those were his three great discoveries. Of the three, I should say, and you may or may not agree with this, since a lot of you probably read a lot of golden age science fiction, the most influential, the most intelligent, the most inventive and significant writer was Heinlein. And Heinlein in the early 1940s dominated science fiction as a writer. And we will come to Heinlein. That's not to say anything negative about Asimov or Van Vock, but Heinlein emerged as the most important science fiction writer who was cultivated and had a relationship with Campbell. Eventually, the two of them parted ways personally, but for a number of years, they were very close, and Heinlein published his first stories and lots of his later stories with Campbell. So, in the early 1940s, Heinlein created this timeline. And Robert Heinlein was a ex-naval officer who was a bit on the mystical side, very politically attuned, and had a knack for writing believable, interesting characters and very engaging stories. And he began to publish, as I mentioned, with Campbell in Astounding in 1939. His first story was Lifeline. And after he had written a number of stories, it hit him, and it hit Campbell too at the same time, that Heinlein was outlining through these stories a future history of humanity over the next few hundred years. And Heinlein put this timeline together, which Campbell published in one of the issues of Astounding. And on here, you could see on the left-hand side about 25 stories that Heinlein wrote, a lot of them, a couple of them he never got around to writing, which laid out a future history of humanity over the next 3 centuries. And it actually, if you follow the timeline through there, humanity eventually descends into a chaos and disaster in the near future, and is taken over by religiously oriented, in the United States, tyrannical powers. And eventually there's a rebellion against that. And then we go out into the stars. But that sort of lays out the rough chronology of it. So he wrote all of these, a lot of these stories, or most of these stories, prior to World War II. A few of them he added after that, but he created this timeline. Now, there's an image of him probably in his middle years. And I have up here a number of his most famous novels and stories. All of the future history stories are collected together in the book, The Path Through Tomorrow, which is up there, one image of it. And you can find a lot of his best stories in that book. And in particular, that's the book that lays out his future history. As I mentioned, I think that Heinlein was probably the best and clearly the most influential writer of the Golden Age. And in particular, I would say that he wrote the greatest number of really top-notch science fiction stories and novels of that period. And he wrote a lot of it in 1940 to 1942. He churned out one after another these incredibly imaginative, intelligent stories. And he ended up having multiple stories in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, winning more Hugos and retro Hugos for best novels than any other writer in the history of science fiction. And it would be difficult to know where to even begin with him. But just to give you an example of his imagination and the quality of his writing, early on in 1941, he wrote 2 novellas, which are up there on the screen, by his bootstraps in Universe, which are 2 of the best novellas ever written in science fiction. And By His Bootstraps is a time travel story in which a man actually is able to pull himself forward in time and create a circle in time and create a future for himself through a series of back and forth maneuvers in time travel. It is a very fascinating and well-articulated and mesmerizing story of how you can get circular causality in time, and it all ends up making sense. 10 years later, in the 1950s, and I'll come back to Heinlein in the next webinar, he would write a follow-up called All You Zombies, which carries time travel even further, where a man actually becomes his mother, father, his daughter, and his son. In Universe, which came out the same year, he tells a story about a group of humans who live on a spherical life ship, and they have been in this ship for so long that they have forgotten where they came from. And they believe that the ship is the entire universe because there are no windows in the ship. And they discover at a point along the way that they are a spaceship moving through the universe and were created by people on Earth in times long past. And it is definitely one of his best stories. And it's a very good study of religion and myth. And Heinlein would repeatedly come back to the themes of religion and myth in many of his stories. And if you haven't read either of those two, I would definitely recommend By His Bootstraps and Universe. If This Goes On, which was part of the Future History series, it is the story of how a religious dictatorship emerges in the United States and how a rebellion takes place against it. That's part of the Future History series. The sixth column is a story about Asians invading and conquering the United States and how the United States rebels eventually defeat them. That came out both as a series and then eventually was published as a novel. Methuselah's Children, which is the final story in The Past Through Tomorrow, tells the story of Lazarus Long and a group of humans who through selective breeding live very long periods of life and leave the earth and head out into the universe and make contact with various aliens. And then his best novel of the 1940s, which won a Retro Hugo as best novel of the year, Beyond This Horizon, which is a story about the future in which biotechnology is successfully manipulated and breeding humans towards superhumans. And one other one I should definitely mention here that's very famous for is Waldo. And Waldo is a story about a crippled genius who lives in outer space and creates all kinds of mechanical attachments to his body so he can do everything that a normal physical human could do, and in the end has to save humanity. And from Waldo, that novel, we get the expression Waldos, which are things that are mechanical attachments to the body. Excuse me. These stories were often called the ladder into the future. The characters in them are usually competent humans that Campbell liked. They're interesting humans. They face challenges and they are creating through struggles a better world in the future. Heinlein was a very independent cuss. And even though at first he worked very closely with Campbell on a lot of these, in fact, Campbell gave him the idea for Universe, and Campbell gave a lot of his writers ideas for the stories. Eventually, Heinlein broke from Campbell and stopped writing science fiction during the mid-1940s because he thought that going into the war was more important than writing fiction. And after that, he started writing juvenile science fiction. We'll take him up again in the next webinar on the Silver Age, because Heinlein reemerges in the 1950s again and writes a whole slew of Hugo-winning novels leading up to Stranger in a Strange Land in the early 1960s. But in the early 1940s, he clearly became the most inventive, most diverse, most engaging science fiction writer discovered by Campbell, but eventually disconnecting from him. And Heinlein also got involved in the Hubbard thing, which we'll come back to as well too, when I talk about Hubbard. Now, the second writer here, most people know these 3 laws of robotics. A robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to be harmed. A robot must obey the orders given to it by human beings except where they conflict with the first law. A robot must protect its own existence as long as the protection doesn't conflict with the second law. Now, the 3 laws of robotics are usually attributed to Isaac Asimov. Actually, the 3 laws of robotics were co-created by Asimov and Campbell. Asimov started to write a series of stories about robots that appeared in Astounding magazine. And Campbell worked closely with Asimov. And as these stories were written, Campbell explicated out of the stories these 3 laws. So, and it ends up that Campbell says Asimov formulated them. Asimov said Campbell formulated them. Usually Asimov is the one who's given credit. And the stories were eventually collected into a novel called I, Robot. And I, Robot was eventually made into a movie, and there's a scene from the movie, which has nothing to do pretty much with the stories that Asimov wrote, but Asimov became the premier thinker and writer in the 1930s on robots, and with his I, Robot stories, of which there were 8 that appeared in Astounding. And Isaac Asimov, and there's a couple of pictures of him when he was very young, and then he's a bit older down below. Isaac Asimov grew up on reading science fiction. He started reading it when he was about 9 or 10 years old, because his father had a candy store, and in the candy store, there were pulp magazines, and he convinced his father that reading science fiction was educational. Isaac Asimov, like Campbell, was kind of socially isolated, didn't interact with other people, but was extremely bright. And he became a member of science fiction fan groups when he was very young, and started writing in letters to the editor, and eventually had the courage, given the fact that Campbell was in New York and so was Asimov, went and visited Campbell and convinced himself that he wanted to become a science fiction writer, and had to convince Campbell that he could write decent shit. Okay, Asimov finally got his first story published with Asimov when Asimov got his first story published with Campbell when he was 19 years old. At first, Asimov was just another writer among different writers that Campbell was cultivating. But one day, Campbell suggested, can you write a story in which we have this hypothetical planet that is always, where it's always daylight because it has multiple suns, and every so often, all of the suns disappear and it turns to night. What would happen? And from that, he wrote Nightfall. Asimov wrote Nightfall. Nightfall was voted as the best science fiction short story of the period of 1900 to 1965. And Nightfall takes place on a hypothetical planet in which we have this civilization, and they're anticipating their final sun going into eclipse from a moon. And when the final sun goes into eclipse from the moon and night falls, all the stars come out and everybody goes mad. And it's a very interesting story that he wrote in 1941, came out in 41, and he became famous over it. Because if you looked up into the sky and saw all of these stars up there for the first time in your life, after only seeing suns and the day, it would drive people crazy, which it did. Now there's an image of I, Robot, the book that collected together the 8 stories that Campbell wrote on robots, in which the main theme that runs through them is creating robots that would obey the 3 laws and the complications that might emerge as a consequence of trying to obey those laws. One thing you get from those stories, and when I read them, I don't know if you get the same impression, is that Asimov seemed to be more sympathetic with the abilities of the robots than with the psychology of humans. The robots very often came out the heroes or the more admirable characters in the iRobot series. And in the end, we have robots who actually have influence and powerful control over all of humanity, which is a theme we'll come back to. Because again, go back to World War II, which this is being written during World War II. Humanity can't seem to be able to control ourselves, so maybe we should turn it all over to robots. Now, in the, say 1943, 1944, somewhere around in there, Asimov got the idea of trying to write a science fiction series based on Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it would be a future history, sort of modeled on Heinlein's future history, which Heinlein had been writing. And so he began to write a series of stories in the 40s, which eventually were collected together into the Foundation series. And the Foundation series has been voted as the best science fiction series ever written as a series. He wrote published three novels at the beginning of the 50s based on the stories of the 40s. He eventually would write several more as sequels to it later on. And in this series, he presents the idea that in the future, a person will emerge. Harry Seldon became very famous in science fiction, fictional character, who's able to work out a predictive mathematics of human behavior and events, a psychohistory it was called, whereby Seldon can predict with this sophisticated mathematics the future history of humanity. And Seldon lives in a time where the galactic empire, thousands and thousands of years in the future, is falling apart. And he proposes that his system, if followed, will be able to avert a 30,000 year period of dark ages in the galaxy and reduce it down to only 1,000 years, because he thinks you could predict mass human behavior. You could predict the future. And the powers of the empire agree to allow him to create a foundation, an encyclopedia of all human knowledge. But Seldon on the side creates a second foundation, which is mysterious and unknown as to its location. And through the series, as it goes on, Seldon repeatedly appears in virtual reality, guiding humanity along to follow his plan. And this plan is guaranteed to reduce the dark ages down to only 1,000 years. But something goes incredibly wrong. An aberration occurs. And indeed, Campbell, after Asimov had started writing the series, told Asimov, I want you to write a story in which Seldon's plan gets unsettled. Something goes wrong. We can't predict the future. There's an abnormality, an aberration that comes into the whole thing, and things go haywire. And so what Asimov came up with, and it appeared as a short novel in Astounding Science Fiction, was The Mule. And the Mule was a character born in the future who was a abused and bizarre human being who had the capacity to influence people's emotions and sets out to conquer the galaxy, and almost does, and throws the whole Seldon psychohistory into disarray. And it's a commentary here on, can we predict the future based on mass behavior? Are there abnormalities or strange things that could occur that will unsettle everything? And he invents the mule as being an embodiment of such an abnormality occurring. And the mule is very fascinating. In the end, you don't know whether or not you want to be sympathetic or antagonistic toward him because he is a very colorful character. He's eventually defeated. But one thing that happens along the way here is that it turns out that the first foundation, which was created in one part of the galaxy, excelled in the physical sciences. The second foundation, the secretive one that was also created at the beginning, excelled in the psychological sciences. And in the end, it is the second foundation, the one who has the more capable, well-developed minds, that rescues Selden's plan and realizes the coming of a new and better era and defeats the mule. The mule is eventually defeated by telepaths, by humans who have excelled in their mental abilities, not in their physical sciences. So Asimov wrote this stuff and other stuff during the 1940s. We'll eventually come back to him again in the 1950s because he kept writing, and in particular, he wrote a series of very interesting novels where we had a robot detective who turns out to be a very admirable and fascinating character in the 1950s. But Asimov was the second significant discovery that Campbell came up with in the early 1940s. The third one was a Canadian by the name of A.E. van Vogt. And in 1939, in the July issue of Astounding, the cover story of that issue was the first published story by van Vogt, and the title was Black Destroyer. And on the cover was this giant black cat. And it was the story about a exploratory human occupied spaceship journeying through the stars that lands on this planet. And on this planet, there is this strange alien that looks sort of like a big black cat. His name is Curl. And Curl has tentacles growing out of its back. And Curl lives by sucking the phosphorus out of living things. And he's the last surviving member of his species. And the humans get tricked into thinking Curl isn't dangerous. And Curl is allowed onto the spaceship. And Curl eventually starts to kill humans. And eventually they realize that Curl is incredibly dangerous, and it's a life or death struggle to find a way to get Curl off of that spaceship. Now, if that sounds a little familiar to you, that story, plus another one that van Vogt would write a little bit later, van Vogt claimed was the basis of the movie Alien. And he actually sued the movie company over rights to the movie because he said they took the idea of Alien from him in Black Destroyer. But Campbell and others will say that the beginning of the Golden Age precisely began on the July 1939 issue of Astounding, where the cover story was Black Destroyer. I should also mention, though, that in that same issue was one of Catherine Moore's best all-time stories, Greater Than Gods, which I'll come back to later on. Heinlein didn't publish his first story till a little bit later. Asimov had a story in there, but they usually will identify that issue, people will, that Black Destroyer was in, which became an extremely popular horror story, science fiction horror story, as the beginning of the Golden Age. Indeed, van Vogt eventually would write 3 other stories about that same spaceship with that same crew, encountering 3 other kinds of extremely dangerous aliens of different forms. And they were collected together in a novel that came out toward the end of the decade called The Voyage of the Space Beagle. And then Vock intentionally took the title from Darwin's The Voyage of the Beagle. But in this case, instead of a ship exploring the Earth, we have a ship exploring the galaxy and running into extremely dangerous aliens. It's a very, very good story, a very, very good novel in terms of imaginative inventiveness for bizarre and dangerous aliens. And indeed, people will identify that book as thematically inspirational for lots of Star Trek episodes, where the Star Trek crew will encounter various kinds of dangerous aliens. In that book is one of the other stories, is another alien who in fact lays its eggs inside of humans, which is also part of Alien 2. So Van Vogt got off to a really good start with Campbell and with Astounding, with the story of Black Destroyer, and then The Voyage of the Space Beagle, which comes along a little bit later. But Van Vogt stated that he often wrote his stories based on dreams. And so his stories often have a psychedelic kind of quality to them. And people will say that he actually was influential on the kind of style that developed Philip K. Dick. But in 1941, he wrote Slan, which was given a retro Hugo as the best science fiction novel of the year. And Slan was about a bunch of superhumans who live in the future and are being hunted down after being ostracized by regular humans. It's a story about a group of humans who have super intelligence, super physical strengths, and have to struggle to stay alive in a world that doesn't want anything different. And science fiction fans identified with Slan and said, as a common expression, that fans are slans, in the sense that science fiction fans thought that they were special, they thought that they were very smart, and thought they were ostracized by humans, by regular humans as well. And Slan became, in my opinion, Van Vogt's best novel, best story that he ever wrote. There's a whole bunch of other stuff up here by Van Vogt. The World of Nole, which also was a novel that he wrote back in the 1940s about a man in search of an identity who realizes his memories are all wrong. That also sounds like Philip K. Dick again. And as I mentioned, Van Vogt wrote his stories based on dreams he had, and in the late 1940s became drawn into the whole Dianetics thing and became really one of the most advocates for the Dianetics movement. There's a lot more in Van Vogt, the weapon shop stories, but that's just a bit about him and his unusual imagery and unusual style. And he was the third influential one. Now, as a general recommendation for people who want to read the good stuff of the 1940s, and Universe is in there, Nightfall is in there, lots of other ones I mentioned are in there, I would recommend go buying the Science Fiction Hall of Fame and Adventures in Time and Space. The Science Fiction Hall of Fame are stories that the Science Fiction Writers of America voted as the best science fiction stories ever written back in the 1960s. The series came out. And so to get a good feel for classic science fiction, especially in the 1940s and the 1950s, these three volumes are just super. And a lot of the ones I've mentioned already, more to come, are included in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, like Universe and Nightfall, and others to come. And this is an image of Shamblu. And Shamblu is a female alien who is a Medusa and a seductress. And this was written in the early 1930s by Catherine Moore. Now, some people will say that Philip Jose Farmer brought sex into science fiction. I would say Catherine Moore brought sex into science fiction with Shamblu. But Shamblu was like a prostitute. And Shamblu would mesmerize male humans when she took off and let flow out her curly and serpentine locks. and kill them in the process. And it's kind of like a detective story attempting to trace Shamblou down. And Catherine Moore started writing on her own in the 1930s, wrote lots of good stuff on her own in the 1930s, and then eventually married Henry Kuttner. And they're the two of them together there, Henry Kuttner and Catherine Moore. And when World War II broke out, Heinlein, Asimov became involved in the war effort much more strongly and didn't write as much, very little. And Campbell had to find new writers to fill up Astounding. And Moore had already been writing and been very popular and ended up pairing together with her husband, Henry Kuttner, and wrote some of the best science fiction of the 1940s. Two stories, both of which are in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. The first one, Mimsy Were the Borogoves. And this is a quote from the beginning of it. "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy were the borogoves and the mum rats outgrave." That is from the Jabberwocky, from Lewis J. Carroll. And they wrote a science fiction story based on that, in which these two kids believe that there's a secret message in this gobbledygook. And if they follow this secret message and create this arrangement of strange objects in their bedroom, they will move into another dimension. And they are being guided by this being from another dimension who actually pulls them into the other dimension, and they disappear to the dismay and misery of their parents. And Mimsy Were the Borogoves, which came out in 42, 43, is a great, great, great endearing science fiction classic. People thought it was like number 5 or number 6 for short stories of all time. 2 years later, they wrote Vintage Season. And in Vintage Season, we have humans from the future who take as their vacation to come back to different periods in history and observe significant events in history. And the story takes place in our present times, where this group of people show up in this hotel, in this resort, future, to observe a meteor crashing into the earth, but they will do nothing to stop it. They come back to observe the big event. In Vintage Season, I think, was their best story, very well done psychologically, and how we could understand what's going to come and we won't do anything about it. And the people from the future won't do anything about it. They will just let it happen, and it does happen. Greater Than Gods is a very, and Moore wrote this by herself, is a variation on The Legion of Time, in which we have a gentleman sitting at his desk with 2 holographic images, takes place in the future, of the 2 women he's madly in love with, and he doesn't know which one to marry. And all of a sudden, those 2 holographic images, one after the other, comes to life. And these faces and voices from the future of a great, 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 great granddaughter and a great, 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 great grandson vie with his attention over which of the 2 women to marry. And in both cases, both futures don't look good. And so he ends up deciding to marry his secretary. It's a really great story. Okay, and it has the element of time war in it again. And Greater Than Gods is in the best of C.L. Moore. The one, though, that always stuck out in my memory, and one last one on Kuttner and Moore, was a story they wrote toward the end of the 1940s called Private Eye. And it's a great synthesis of psychology and technology. In the future, what if the police could observe, if need be, everything that happened any place on the surface of the earth by playing back the optical acoustical records that have been impacted into the surfaces of objects. So no matter what you do, somebody could go back and look and see what you did. And so in this context, we have a man who's raised by a fundamentalist, punitive father who throws him in a closet with a sign in there, God, thou God seest thee, and grows up very passive. And somebody steals his fiancée away from him and decides he's going to commit the perfect crime by trying to make it appear that he murders the man who stole his fiancée, but not intentionally, but accidentally. And he ends up committing the perfect crime in this future world in which everything you do can be recorded and observed later on. So the idea of people being surveyed, being watched, et cetera, that idea goes way back. And Private Eye has a great ending to it, and I wouldn't even give you the ending to it because he gets away with the crime, but that's not quite the end of it. But it was a superb novel, and I used to use it, use it in science fiction and psychology courses all the time. Okay, so this might be a good stop to take a break. It's 5 after right now. Okay, so now let's, okay. All right, good, okay. So let's go on sort of quickly through some other significant writers during the Golden Age besides the ones that I've mentioned already. The first one I want to mention, L. Sprague de Camp wrote what is considered to be one of the best time travel stories ever written back in the late 1930s, right at the beginning of the period of Campbell's editorship, Lest Darkness Fall. And Lest Darkness Fall is about a man from the present day who is an archaeologist and historian and student of military history, who is thrown back to 535 AD when the Roman Empire is collapsing, and decides to work toward avoiding the Dark Ages by introducing various bits of knowledge and technologies in 6th century Italy and Rome that will avert the Dark Ages, and does. So what we have here is we have an alternative history. What if the Dark Ages had never occurred? And this is a story about a man who goes back in time and actually avoids the Dark Ages to come in the future. Great, great engaging novel. L. Sprague de Camp was a historian himself, had a great knowledge of ancient history, and tells a very convincing and realistic story of the ongoing collapse of the Roman Empire and how it's averted. The Incomplete Enchanter, which was published in Campbell's second magazine, which he started, Unknown, which was on fantasy in 1939. I hope that isn't my gardener people coming here today. Somebody just pulled up in front of my yard, but excuse me. The Incomplete Enchanter is a story about how perhaps the world that we see around us is a consequence of the logical framework of our mind, and people who are crazy actually have the wrong logical framework in their mind. And the way to cure them is to change their logical framework. But on the other hand, if you were to completely alter it into an atypical logical framework, their minds would immediately move into a parallel universe where their logical framework would work just fine. And so he tells a story about a man who discovers the mathematics of altering the universe in which you exist, and the man is transported into a universe that's actually built around Norse mythology. And magic works and science doesn't. He also wrote one of the first science fiction handbooks on how to write science fiction, and was one of the best writers in the early 1940s, writing for both Unknown and writing for Astounding Stories. One of the most touching stories that's in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame is by Lester Del Rey, who was another important writer during that time. And it's Helen O'Loy. And Helen O'Loy is a story about a woman who was a robot that a man falls in love with, and that eventually the woman dies. But it is very romantic, and by the time you're finished with it, you're thoroughly convinced that you could fall in love with a female robot yourself, okay? Definitely read it if you haven't, Helen O'Loy by Lester Del Rey. And then thirdly up here, I have a couple stories written by Murray Leinster, who I've already talked about in a previous webinar. And Murray Leinster wrote in the mid-1940s the story First Contact, which is in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, definitely one of the best short stories of all times in science fiction. It's a story about a human spaceship and an alien spaceship who meet each other in a nebula, and they both realize that they can't let the other one leave, because if they do, they will follow them back to their own world, which would be absolutely dangerous, and they don't want the other ship to know where they came from. And they have to somehow figure out how to negotiate a peace, given the fact that they're both utterly strangers to each other and both utterly dangerous to each other. And it's a very fascinating psychological discussion of how you communicate with an alien, done well, not just some simple kind of story about contact with aliens. Exploration Team, which also won a Hugo, is a story about a man who's on another planet who was trained and bioengineered 4 giant Klondike bears, who he trusts more than he trusts robots, to defeat these alien lizards who live on the planet. And it's a great adventure story. And as I said, it was also given a Hugo as best novella of the year. Those two in particular by Leinster. Leinster kept writing through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s and 60s. Also during that period, and notice the babe up there, by the way, we'll come to that one, that image, because that's from a very famous novel. In the 1940s, Jack Williamson continued to write great stuff. Darker Than You Think is a novel about the idea that perhaps in our distant past, there were 2 kinds of Homo sapiens. We won out, but there was a second kind that existed and went into hiding. The second kind of Homo sapiens were shapeshifters who could change their shape into different animal forms. And werewolves, vampires, witches are all examples of this second form of human species that still exists in the world today. So we're given an evolutionary theory, a historical theory of what werewolves and vampires really are, and they're intent on defeating us and taking us over. But the best thing I think that Williamson ever wrote first came out as With Folded Hands, came out number 3 as best all-time novella, and then he turned it into a novel, The Humanoids, is a story about humans creating robots that are there to serve and protect us, the prime directive. And the robots learn how to reproduce themselves and keep getting smarter and spreading through the universe, and decide that we are incapable of taking care of ourselves very well. And they could do a better job of protecting us than we can, protecting us from ourselves. And while this is going on, a scientist is trying to discover the fundamental law of the universe, which the robots are also trying to figure out too. And the robots figure it out, that the fundamental principle underlying the universe is thought and consciousness, and not the physical world. And by discovering that, the robots build this great machine that is able to facilitate thought reading of all humans. And in the end, the final scientist in the story, although he rebels against the robots, doesn't want somebody taking care of him, he loses the fight. And in the end, the robots, the humanoids, are the ones who control reality. And they do it because they're trying to serve us. So you got to get that together with Asimov's laws of robotics, because in Asimov's laws of robotics, robots are there to serve us, not to hurt us. The humanoid story takes that literally, where the humanoids decide that they are a better judge of what is human quality life than humans are. And in the end, they win. And they become our masters and servants at the same time. And so it's a very a fascinating story at multiple levels, and it's a really significant story in many regards with respect to AI, robots. We're going to create something that's going to serve us. They get smarter than us, and they're eventually going to decide that they're better at taking care of us than we are. And done very well. Eric Frank Russell was a very popular writer also in the 1940s. In the beginning of Unknown Stories, when that magazine came out, his novel Sinister Barrier was in there. And Sinister Barrier became one of the most famous novels of the 1940s. And Sinister Barrier was based on the premise that perhaps there are invisible aliens on the earth who are feeding off of us mentally and manipulating us, and we don't know they're there until one man discovers that there are all of these alien beings that are circling around all around us, and that feed off of intense human emotions, and they're causing all of the wars through human history because they feed off of passion. And we discovered this and enter into a war with them, attempting to defeat them. And it's very fast-paced, very interesting, very engaging, and it plays on human paranoia again, that perhaps there's something manipulating us. That had come up with Doc Smith and the Lensman series too. But Sinister Barrier is usually regarded as one of the great science fiction novels of the 1940s. And Russell wrote a lot of other stuff during that time. And if you want to go look, there's a best of Eric Frank Russell, and you could look at his writing during that period. Okay. Next person, Frederick Brown. Frederick Brown wrote a story called Arena, which was twisted and turned a little bit and turned into a Star Trek episode. And in this story, we have a human and an alien who are thrown into this force field bubble and have to fight it out with each other. And one of them is going to have to die. And whichever one dies, their whole species is going to go extinct, because this powerful alien intelligence has decided that humans and this other alien species both can't coexist, and one of them has to go. And so the human has to figure out how he's going to defeat the other alien who wants to, of course, defeat and kill him. And it became one of the Star Trek episodes where we had Kirk fighting against the giant lizard, although that actually was a bit of a distortion of the way the story reads. In the story, the alien he has to fight is like an octopus. But that was Arena, and that's in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame too. Now then, a couple years later, Brown wrote one of the best science fiction stories of the novels of the 1940s, one of the 3 or 4 best. What Mad Universe? And a lot of people say this is the best science fiction novel of 1949. Now, this story involves a man who is an editor for a science fiction magazine. He goes to a party up in New York, upstate New York, and a spaceship which has just been sent off from the Earth crashes, and its engine smashes into the resort where he's at, blows up, and throws him into an alternate universe. And in this alternate universe, aliens from the moon have come to the Earth and are walking around, and they're big purple creatures. Lots of different things that happen in science fiction space operas are true in this reality. Women astronauts dress up in seductive bikini outfits. The Arcturians plan on killing the entire human race. A man discovers space travel through monkeying around with a sewing machine, and he gets seen as a spy, and New York is all dead, and all kinds of other crazy things. Now, you may not have picked it up from my description, but this is one of the funniest science fiction novels ever written, What Mad Universe? Because what he does is he throws a character into an alternate universe in which everything that normally he would expect, a lot of it has been changed. It turns out he is a science fiction writer, and he's not a science fiction editor, and he has one surprise after another. In fact, there's really kind of no way to describe this except to say you'll be laughing from the second or the third page with it. And And a lot of people have thought, yeah, this is one of the best things written during the 1940s. Frederick Brown, What Mad Universe. If you've never read it, I definitely highly recommend it as a really great novel which spoofs space operas on one hand. It's a satire on space operas. Imagine you lived in a world where all the things in space operas are true. And you are this character trying to figure out what the hell is going on here and how to stay alive. Now, one other story worth mentioning from the Golden Age, which became very famous, was written in 1940 by Harry Bates, called Farewell to the Master. And Farewell to the Master is about the spaceship that comes to the Earth. And on the spaceship, there is a humanoid, and then there is this giant robot that emerge out of the spaceship. And humans, in their stupidity and paranoia, shoot the humanoid alien. In the story, they kill him. Not in the movie they made of it, but in the story, they kill him. And at the end of the story, the spaceship is going to leave, and this reporter goes up to the robot. That's the robot there, by the way. That's from the original story. Goes up to the robot and tells the robot, would you please say goodbye to your master? Assuming that the humanoid alien who was killed was the master. And the robot replies, you are mistaken. I am the master. Now, this story, 11 years later, was made into The Day the Earth Stood Still. It was changed around a bit, where Michael Rennie, who plays the humanoid alien, is shot, but comes back to life, but isn't going to stay alive forever. But in the story, he's actually killed. And it comes out in the movie that, the aliens have decided that humans are too dangerous, they're causing trouble, and they better get their act together. And the way the aliens got their act together was to turn over control to the robots, which indeed is what the title Farewell to the Master means, that the robots become the masters. It's a very moving story. I think the story is better than the movie, but it's another fascinating perspective on our relationship with robots, and should we control our destiny, or should we turn it over to artificial intelligence? Now, keep in mind, again, World War II is going on now. Disaster is going on. People are questioning whether humans can govern their own lives, their own destiny. And then maybe it is better that we turn it over to robots. Campbell, on the other hand, thinks that, no, we need to develop our minds. Technology isn't enough. We need to develop our minds. That's the way to go, And so he asked people to write stories with strong characters, and Heinlein does that for sure, with strong characters who could solve problems, deal with challenges, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, Campbell is also thinking that, science fiction is being prophetic, and he wants people to write stories that deal with the possibilities of the future, and the future as it pertains to what's going to happen in the world right then with World War II. And in fact, he has one writer who writes a story about the creation of an atomic bomb, which Campbell thinks is nothing much, but it actually has the US government come and investigate it because there was too much stuff in the story that sounded just like the atomic bomb as it was being developed in the United States at the time. So Campbell is concerned with the future of humanity, and he thinks science fiction could lead the way and provide ideas, provide inventiveness, help us scientifically, etc. But Campbell has another writer who had appeared on the scenes back in the 1940s as well, early 1940s, L. Ron Hubbard. And L. Ron Hubbard started to publish fantasy and science fiction back during those early years under the mentorship of Campbell. But Hubbard was a bullshitter from the get-go. And Hubbard was mentally distressed, let's put it that way, from the beginning. And Hubbard would make up stories about exploits he was on. Hubbard liked to go adventure throughout the world. Hubbard joined the Navy at the beginning of the war, but after 80 days, I think, he was relieved of his command of a ship because he couldn't demonstrate any good leadership. He had incredible problems with women, And but he had all of these ideas in his head about how to cure himself, of how to turn himself into a better person, blah, blah, blah. He got involved in hypnotism. He got involved in psychotherapy. He would tell people he read all this stuff and studied all this wisdom from all over the world. And this is a quote from Hubbard. I don't know when he stated this, but at some point he said, you don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, you start a religion. And so him and Campbell, and it was the two of them, whether you know this or not, the two of them who created and developed the idea of Dianetics in the late 40s. And Dianetics was going to be the science of the mind. And Campbell was looking for the science of the mind, the way to change the human mind so we'd be saner, more logical. We could control our world. A science of the mind that transcended Freud, transcended psychiatry, and that would provide us with a method for improving the mentality of our species. And that's how Dianetics emerged. And Campbell, in fact, was the first person, and this is what I've read, we can go back and check on it, who used the expression Dianetics. And Campbell and Hubbard tried to bring other science fiction writers into the fold here, advertising it in Astounding magazine during the late 1940s, that this was the key to the future. Now there's an image of Hubbard when he's younger, and there's an image of Hubbard when he's older on the other side, but this thing is getting created by these two, as Asimov called it, two messiahs, who couldn't both be messiahs of the same religion. You can't have two messiahs, as Asimov put it. And they eventually broke apart in the late 1940s. But Dianetics got strongly associated with Campbell, got strongly associated with Astounding Stories, got associated with Flim Flam. In fact, there's a quote there from a reviewer of the book that said, there's never been a book in human history that had so many promises and so little evidence in it. But Campbell believed that this was going to be the greatest revolution in human thinking ever. He firmly believed that. And he thought Hubbard was the key to it. And Hubbard was a bullshitter. Hubbard went from one thing to another. Hubbard made up big, tall stories. Hubbard said lots of things about himself that never happened. And Hubbard started making lots and lots of money once the book came out. And at that point, the two of them went their separate ways. But Campbell wanted some kind of solution to the problems of life. And he thought that Dianetics was going to be it. Now, Campbell, keep in mind, was educated in physics, although he had dabbled in parapsychology too. But Campbell wasn't a psychologist, but Campbell just bought this whole thing up and became an auditor with Hubbard, where they would train other people. And they spooked out lots of science fiction writers. They drew other ones in, like Vock became significantly involved. Heinlein at first was sort of interested, and then he backed off from the whole thing. Asimov was never interested in it. But this is where we come to the end of the 1940s with Campbell getting just totally enthused with Dianetics and L. Ron Hubbard. And Campbell was more logical of the two, or less prone to what am I called? Craziness. But somebody else has commented the two of them became extremely grandiose in this endeavor. So this is part of what happens with science fiction, part of what happens after the war, part of what happens with this crazy writer who was very prolific early on, but I don't think he ever wrote anything that was really that good. I mean, some people will say certain stories by him have been good, but he eventually became a flim flam man, and he made billions of dollars probably in the process. Now, during the 1940s, we had a lot of new comics come out, new comic characters. After Superman, there was Batman, there was the Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Captain America. One thing to note about the comics of the era is we keep getting all of these new superheroes. Now, an issue of the 40s, as embodied in, say, for example, Slan by Van Vock versus Heinlein's competent man, a competent protagonist, is whether we need a Superman to save us, or whether with basic human intelligence and education and practical skills, we could save ourselves. Comics went in the direction of superheroes, superhumans. including Wonder Woman and Captain America. And in fact, that image of Captain America there is, I think he's, no, he's not fighting Nazis there, but he was fighting Nazis in some of the issues. So comics went that direction even until today, we see with comics that the salvation of humanity is in the superhero, the Slan character, the super evolved, that the robots won't do it and we can't do it ourselves and we need some kind of savior. And the savior will have extraordinary powers like Superman did. So that's going on during the 1940s too. Now, in 1937, a woman wrote a novel, but originally the author's name given on the novel was Murray Constantine, a male's name. She didn't want to publish it under her real name, a woman's name, Catherine Burdekin. And this was a story, a novel, that took place 700 years in the future. And what she predicted, and this is written in 37, and obviously fascism, Nazism are on the rise then. She predicted that Germany and Japan would win a war with the Allies. They would divide the world between them, and Hitler would end up being seen as a god. And the entire West would be ruled by the 1,000-year Reich that Hitler had predicted. And this novel opens 700 years in the future, where followers of this religious government tyranny of the future are in a church reciting the Hitlerian Creed, which is a variation on the Apostles' Creed. And it's an intense and crazy and powerful opening to this book, Swastika Night. And it's the story of how one man discovers that the history that the Nazis wrote is not true. That history has been changed. Hitler is depicted as a 7-foot-tall, blonde-haired character. Women have been subjugated into passive, head-shaven, submissive individuals by homosexual males. Males become homosexual and just use women to procreate. That's it. And it's the story of the struggle of this one man trying to get this knowledge preserved and spread across the globe, that we've been hoodwinked because the world is falling apart 700 years in the future. But it's been ruled by the Nazis for 700 years, as well as Japan. And it's a very vivid, prescient vision of a dystopian future, one of the best dystopian novels of the 20th century. And it didn't get a lot of attention to begin with, but more lately, it's got a lot more attention, right? And it's a story about rewriting history. So the question becomes again, is the history that we believe explains how we got here the correct history, or is it a distorted history that the victors rewrote based on something that was totally different? Where our heroes of the past really were not what we believed they were at all. It's a big con job. And the ultimate con job, historical con job, would be 1984. And 1984 was published in 1949 and opens with a very powerful line. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. And I have up here the image of Brave New World and Aldous Huxley, because I talked about that earlier as an earlier famous dystopia where people of the future live in a world with no pain. 1984 is the converse. People live in a world with no pleasure. And in this hypothetical world, which is a totalitarian, authoritarian world where the state that the central character lives in is ruled by this mythical, perhaps real, but probably mythical character, Big Brother, controls everything and spies on everybody. And there are three world states in this future world: Oceania, Eurasia, and what was the third one? I forgot. Well, there's three. And there was a third, and East Asia. That's the third one. And they're perpetually at war with each other. The central character works in the Ministry of Truth, where his job is to keep rewriting history every time there's a change of power, a change of opinion as to what actually is going on in the world. And he becomes a rebel, and he has a sexual affair with a woman who is a rebel. And in the end, they're caught, and they are made to renounce their love for each other. And it's a very bleak and powerful novel of a future in which the truth is always distorted. We're always at war. It serves the state to always be at war. Everybody spies on each other. We have a figurehead. We have a mythical nemesis called Goldstein, who probably doesn't even exist, who is always being tried and hunted after. And Orwell's vision here was presumably based on his understanding of Stalin and communist Soviet Union, that his image of the totalitarian authoritarian system. And so it's another example of the fear that our freedom will be taken away from us. People have said that 1984 was inspired by Zamyatin's We, in which freedom is something that we want to get rid of. In 1984, freedom is something gotten rid of. And that's something that runs through all 20th century dystopias, not all of them, but a lot of them, that the dystopia is built on the elimination of individual freedom. That's the terrible sin. That's the thing that the dystopia, the bleak image of the future, robs us of. That's our freedom. Although Eric Fromm was arguing right around the same time that people don't like freedom and let somebody else determine how the world is going to be run. And it's also about the fact that love does not conquer all, because in the end, the main character, Winston Smith, renounces his love for his woman lover, Julia, because he's put in a cage with rats, which he totally fears above everything else. So it's a very bleak and terrible kind of story, but it's a warning story. It's a warning of how government distorts the truth, distorts history, how we can engage in contradictory doublespeak concepts. There's famous lines in it like ignorance is strength, war is peace, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of the expressions in 1984 became part of our everyday language. And 1984 is frequently listed as one of the 10 best novels of the 20th century. And usually everybody ends up reading it in high school at some place along the way. But it's a second vision of an authoritarian, totalitarian system of fear of what is to come in the future, where humanity, in this case here, gets controlled by mysterious forces above and is made to believe in various things that aren't true. And we are robbed of all of our pleasure because people can't engage in sex except for reproduction in 1984. You could have a whole course on 1984. And that's just a little brief snippet on that novel. But dystopias kept being written, and Swastika Night in 1984 too, expressing the fear humanity has of what possible negative things could happen in the future. In this case here, being robbed of our freedom and history being distorted and being perpetually at war with each other as a way to maintain, in quote, a kind of peace. Now, into this fray of how to go in the future, we have C.S. Lewis enter the scene. Great friend of J.R.R. Tolkien and a writer of fantasy, a classicalist, and C.S. Lewis, who was outside mainstream science fiction, back in the 1940s, inspired by Lindsay's A Voyage to Arcturus, which I talked about back 2 or 3 webinars ago, decided he was going to write a space series. Actually, him and Tolkien had gotten together, and Tolkien was going to write one about time travel, which he never did. But Lewis did write one about space travel inspired by Lindsay, and sort of provoked a bit also by Stapleton's books, which he found immoral. And he wrote a trilogy in which the characters in this trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and the Hideous Strength, travel to Mars, travel to Venus, and deal with troubles on the Earth in the third one, that Hideous Strength. And it involves a thinly veiled allegorical space opera of Christianity versus Satan. When the character travels to Mars to begin with, in the first one, Out of the Silent Planet, he learns that the Earth is the silent planet, and the Earth is off bounds to the rest of the solar system because the Earth has been taken control of by the Bent One. And the Bent One was an angel who had been sent to the Earth to watch over the Earth, but had rebelled against the ruler of the solar system, who eventually turns out to be Jesus Christ, and has led humanity in the wrong direction. And in Perelandra, the character goes to Venus, where he encounters another Adam and Eve, but Adam and Eve have never experienced the fall, but a character comes to that planet to tempt Eve into doing something forbidden by God, and eventually is saved. That hideous strength, and that hideous strength comes from a reference to the Tower of Babel, is about the agents of Satan gaining control of a giant scientific organization with the attempt to destroy the Earth. And the enemy is seen through all of this as scientific objectivism and materialism. Satan is an advocate of that view of existence, where the characters who are the good guys in there are advocates of spiritualism. And the battle that goes on through these three novels is a battle between the forces of Satan, thinly veiled as aliens, with a ruling alien who actually is modeled on Jesus Christ, the son of the old one, the Father, and a retelling of the Garden of Eden, and each planet having its own guardian angel who is an alien, and the fight between good and evil. And he presents this as a space opera. And it's a very famous space opera, very famous 3-volume set. And I don't want to be critical of it. I don't find it exactly engaging, although it's very inventive. I didn't find it really engaging, in part because you could see that C.S. Lewis had this philosophy of the meaning of life, what was the good, what was wrong with the world, and it sort of structures the whole series. And it is fascinating how he could take all of the fundamental Christian themes and put them in a space opera setting. And that part is fascinating. So that's another answer to the problem of our times, the problem of the 40s, as Lewis saw it. The problem is that we're losing our spirituality and we're giving in to scientific objectivist materialism. And that's what we got to fight against. And that's what Satan stands for. Now, the story that I had listed when I was younger as the best science fiction short story ever written, although a lot of people say it isn't science fiction, was written in 1941 by Jorge Luis Borges, who was an Argentine writer. And the story was called The Library of Babel. And it's a very short story, maybe it's about 10, 12 pages long. And it's a story about the nature of existence. And I would use it in courses that I used to teach on science fiction because I thought it was such a mind-twisting, inventive story. And this was written during the golden age outside of pop science fiction magazines, but it is so pregnant with implications. A man, he lives in this giant library, a library that seems to go on forever. And he lives with other people in this library. And the library is a repetition of the same rooms over and over and over and over again. And in every room, there are hundreds and hundreds of books. And when you open the books up, most of them seem to be gibberish. In fact, just random sequences of letters, but no two books seem to be the same. And little by little, he realizes, and so do his fellow citizens in the library, that every book that could possibly be written is somewhere in the library. That is to say, if you had 25 letters and repeated them over and over again in every possible combination with 400-page books, that would be the content of the library. That would mean that somewhere in the library is an exact duplication of everything I have said for the last hour and a half. Plus, every copy of Life magazine, every copy of Time magazine, every copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica, every book that humans have ever written, interspersed between umpteen, innumerable, quintillion upon quintillions of books of total nonsense. That is to say, if you imagined that you had a library with books with every possible sequence of letters in them, that every possible book that ever has been written and could be written is in that library. And that's the universe he lives in. And so he ponders the meaning of that. And so should everybody else. This is a metaphor on the nature of existence, literally. And I will often say to people that no matter what you're about to say, and no matter what you will invent, it already exists in the Library of Babel, somewhere in there. It's got to be in there. And in fact, in the Library of Babel is a book explaining the Library of Babel. It has to be there. Plus an umpteen million books giving you false answers. So how do you know which is the right answer and which is the wrong answer? How do you find a little bit of order in this indeterminately large amount of chaos? And interestingly, back 20, 30 years ago, someone developed a virtual instantiation of the Library of Babel. If you go on the web, you can go into the Library of Babel. The Library of Babel actually exists because all you have to do is compute this thing out and plug it in and you can wander through it. I would spend lots of times thinking about, first of all, I had to figure out how many books there were in the Library of Babel. There is a number. It is an immensely big number. I figured it out, you know. I don't know if it's more than Google Books, for example. But I found this to be very fascinating short story. And it's a story about, you know, how do you find meaning in life? Is there meaning in life? Is there meaning in the universe? What are the possibilities? Is there free will? Is everything that ever could be and will be somehow already somewhere embodied or written down, et cetera, et cetera? Now, we're just about coming to the end. We're on our last two slides. The two books that I think are the two best novels of the golden age, one written by a man outside of the scientific tradition who was educated in biology, ecology. George Stewart, in 1949, wrote Earth Abides. This was the first winner of the International Fantasy Award. And it's a story about a man who goes up into the woods, gets bitten by a rattlesnake, almost dies, and when he comes back down, almost everybody in the world has died from a plague. And he attempts to try to recreate civilization as the final remnants of civilization are falling apart. And he contemplates why humanity has gone into this incredible swift decline. that there were too many of us. We lost touch with nature. Nature is now coming back and reasserting itself. Can we recreate civilization? And in the end, he dies, although he does meet a woman who interestingly turns out to be partially African-American. They produce some children, and humanity starts over again, but at a much more in tune with nature and understanding of nature, like they go back to a kind of indigenous American Indian civilization. And it's an amazingly touching and powerful story. And anybody who ever reads this novel will say this is one of the best. And I highly recommend it. It was written by somebody outside of science fiction. It's a disaster, but it's also, you know, an image of collapse and then rejuvenation again. But now we're going to get more in touch with nature and we're going to forget everything from before. He tries to preserve, but he never can. And we're going to start again. Very, very touching, very, very moving novel. Earth Abides. And it was the first winner of the International Fantasy Award. 2 years later, this novel won Best Novel of the Year for the International Fantasy Award. City. And there's a quote up there, which is how this novel begins. Now, Clifford Simak was a writer, popular writer in the science fiction magazine tradition. He started writing back in the 1930s, but then in the 1940s, he wrote a series of stories which got collected at the end of the 1940s into a novel called City. And it begins with these lines. These are the stories that the dogs tell when the fires burn high and the wind is from the north. What is man, they'll ask, or perhaps what is a city, or what is a war? There is no positive answer to any of these questions. This novel has been republished numerous times. Here's just a sample of all the different covers of this novel since it first came out in the 1950s. This unequivocally is one of my all-time favorite science fiction novels, City, because it is so imaginative and so touching, and the dogs can talk. To set the context here, we're in the near future. The Webster family has a big house out away from the city. They have bought a new robot, Jenkins, which takes care of the Webster family. And Jenkins is the central character in the story because the Websters keep aging and dying, but Jenkins is still there. And Jenkins keeps living century to century. And at some point, Jenkins teaches animals how to speak in the future. Humans go off and start exploring the solar system and realize that they can live a much more incredible existence embodied on Jupiter and change their bodies, and almost all humanity moves to Jupiter. One character, though, who is kind of like a mutant, strange, savant individual, begins to train and cultivate ants back on the earth. And he trains the ants so the ants become this powerful civilization that begins to spread across the earth. Jenkins eventually realizes that the ants are going to take control of the earth and has to find some way to get all of the sentient animals off of the earth, and all the humans have left. And he tries jumping into an alternative or future time. And instead of going into a future time, he ends up in an alternate earth. And he discovers the ghoulies, I think that's what they're called, but these hideous kind of ghostly beings who live in an alternative earth. And so he ends up coming back and he takes the animals and he goes into a different alternate earth where all evidence of humanity is disappeared, because now the ants have taken control of the earth and all the rest of humanity has gone out to Jupiter. It's crazily inventive and crazily touching. And Jenkins is the robot as the central character. And in the end, the dogs and the animals who now are sentient live on an alternate earth and they don't even know if humans ever actually existed. And it's a kind of touching end to the golden age, because even if there was this great feeling of threat, there were all these different efforts to respond to it with Campbell and Heinlein and Asimov, and how are we going to deal with it? And it all may go downhill. In the end, we have City, where there's this sense of the ephemerality of humanity, that, you know, we're here now and we may disappear and something may come and take our place. And we may struggle, there may be a lot of sound and fury, we may try to conquer, we may try to achieve, but in the end, the dogs are going to sit around the fire and wonder, what the hell was man? And did man have any reality? And what was a city and what was war? And that's a good way to end the golden age, with this highly philosophical, very inventive, imaginative novel by Clifford Simak. More to come on Clifford Simak later on. I won't do the review since we're already 5 minutes over right now. Forget the review, but I will do the little preview. And here we have Kamel. And the next thing we're going to do, or I'm going to do, is the Silver Age. I take that expression from John Clute, who referred to the 1950s primarily as the Silver Age. And this is a cover from Galaxy Science Fiction magazine. And in the 1950s, other science fiction magazines rose up to challenge Campbell and the dominance of astounding science fiction. And one of the most popular of the new magazines of the 50s was Galaxy. And one of the most popular of the new writers of the 1950s was Cornwainer Smith. And one of his most famous stories was The Ballad of Lost Kamel. And this is a great magazine cover of Kamel with this other strange being that looks kind of like a bird human behind her. And it's a fantastic cover. And when we come back,